Hi folks, and welcome to Tech Talk. My name is Anu. My guest today is Winblad of Winblad Venture Partners. Come join me. Hi Ann, it's great to meet you and thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. You are founding partner of the immensely successful Winblad Venture Partners. And you have participated in some of the most extraordinary transformations in the world of entrepreneurship. You originally hail from Minnesota. You were born and raised in Minnesota. You're the eldest of 6 children. Your mother was a nurse, and then your father was a high school basketball coach. I'd like to start at your very beginnings. What was childhood like?
I grew up in a small town and called Farmington, Minnesota, about 2,000 people. Now it's grown into a suburb of Minneapolis, so it's got about 12,000 people. But it was fantastic. It was long before there were any digital natives, so we read a lot of books. I think I read the entire high school library almost at one time, especially the biographies. My dad was the first one to go to college in his family and graduate from college, so he was very focused on education. We are a very close family. We actually all like each other. Years ago, Wired magazine wrote an article about me and said I was from one of the 7 remaining functional families in the United States, and I think that's a good description of my family. So it was great. I went to public schools. Minnesota is renowned for the quality of its public schools. My mother's parents came from Germany, my dad's grandparents from Sweden, so there was still a lot of feeling that we were young in our history in the United States. So I think education was really, really highly valued in our family. And so we loved reading. I don't think we actually could afford a television set until I was about 8. So I never really liked cartoons. Yeah. So it was really fun. I remember the day that we got our first set of encyclopedias, and my 4 sisters and brother and I were so excited to start with A and try to claw our way to Z in the encyclopedia. So it was a really wonderful time to grow up, one where you love learning. You loved, when you weren't learning, to just be outdoors. So we all, played in the snow, learned how to skate, rode our bikes for miles. So it was very idyllic growing up in Minnesota in the 50s and 60s.
You did things as a family, as a unit.
Yeah.
So nice. As a child, who was the most influential person in your life?
Most certainly my dad. It was really great to have a father who ended up having 5 daughters and 1 son be a basketball coach. So when we would go to sleep at night, he would have his little chalkboard out and would be designing the plays for the basketball players. He would always fall asleep before we did, and we'd wait for that chalkboard to sort of fall onto his lap. He really was a winning and renowned athlete and basketball coach in the state of Minnesota, but he never talked about winning and losing. He talked about the team. And when you're coaching in small towns, not all of your players are stars. So you really have to make them work as a team. And to watch my dad, work as a team, work these teams, and even have the least athletic players be as important as the star player was really great learning for me. My parents also, with 6 kids, and my youngest sister is only 8 years younger than me, so we were all the same age for a long period of time. We never had any rules, but my dad always said one thing when we asked, do we have to be home by a certain time? What about this? He said one important thing: use your own good judgment. And I've shared that with many of my friends when they became parents, because it implies, A, you do have good judgment, you have responsibility for that judgment, and you have to make your own decisions. And that's been very instrumental for me in all of my life choices, including being a venture capitalist.
Sure, sure. Now, you started your career as a programmer, and then you, at the age of 26, founded a company called Open Systems. And by the way, that company, for the time, had a great exit.
Yeah.
That company was focused mostly on, it was all software development, and this was at a time where no one believed that you could make money on just software alone. Tell me the story of Open Systems.
Well, the story of Open Systems is really the story of many starts in the software industry. I took my first programming class in college, and it was like magic to me. I was a math major and business major, and we didn't have a computer science major, but we had classes, so I took them all. And it was just magical. You could just type this stuff in and make things work.
Yeah.
And so it was definitely a focus for me right after that. I worked for a year as a systems programmer at the Federal Reserve Bank in Minneapolis, so I got a chance to see how I would fit in a very large building, in more corporate life, let alone sort of government life. And it was a really good learning experience for me. I worked with really great people, but it wasn't me. And that was really important for me, sort of deciding to take a bigger risk and starting my own company. It was really kind of a group grope in the mid-70s. The same year that we started Open Systems in Minneapolis was the year that Microsoft started. A year later, Apple started. Oracle started at about the same time. And there was no one you could talk to. It wasn't like we had these industry confabs at that point in time where we'd say, hey, you have a software company, I have a software company, you're building hardware.
Yeah.
So everybody was sort of on their own figuring it out. And the pieces really started knitting together. Who were the hardware resellers, what operating systems were coming to the top, but you had to think through everything. You also could make a lot more mistakes because the competition was low. There was probably a higher failure rate than we knew of because people would start these things and you never hear about them. Venture capitalists were not present at all. If you look back at Microsoft at that time, it wasn't like some venture capitalists found them and tried to give them money. Venture capitalists came and tried to give us money, in year 5. By that time, we didn't need the money nor, want the venture capitalists. So it really was this sort of magical time where the industry was just starting. Nobody really knew what they were doing. The tools were really crummy, even the early operating systems. So you had to really work hard to make this stuff work. And if you made too many bad choices, you just were gone. We made one important choice which helped us survive, and that was probably because I'm a female. And at that time, there were a bunch of computers you could actually program on, but you had to put them together. They were kits, and even do some soldering. And for me, I set a rule like, I don't know how to solder anything, and I'm not really good at putting these kits together. So we're not supporting any computers that aren't already put together. And that was really, really key because we then picked the best hardware to actually put our software on. And we didn't end up getting in cul-de-sacs with some of this way too early hardware, which took a lot of early software companies down in the mid-70s.
Sure. The thing about you is you're such a visionary to realize back in the 70s that software was going to be our future. My next question for you is, how and when did you realize that you wanted to be a venture capitalist, and how was Winblad founded?
Well, I actually never realized that I wanted to be a venture capitalist. After Open Systems was acquired, I realized 2 things. 1, winter was optional. I was still in Minnesota. And 2, I now had the money to be able to afford to move to San Francisco, where there was much more of a software industry. And when I moved out here, when Open Systems was acquired, there weren't that many acquisitions of software companies, so it was big news.
Yeah.
So I was in even the local papers about my little company being acquired. So venture capitalists here started calling me up. So this is 1987.
Okay.
And saying, well, I invested in a software company and it seems to be failing. Can you come over here and look at it? So I did a lot of these, look at broken software companies for venture capitalists, and I thought, these guys, don't know what they're doing. I mean, it's obvious why these companies are breaking. And, you know, I'm really glad I never took any money from a venture capitalist, because basically they don't really understand software. And one of the last companies that I was willing to do this at, I went to the board and told them, I said, here, you know, here's how this is supposed to work in a software company, and here's how your company is working, which is not going to work in the long term. And John Hummer was on that board. And they actually decided, as a result of my meeting, to finish an acquisition with that company and just move on. But John said, you know, I really do think there's more opportunity in this software thing, and I want to start a software-only venture fund. Would you be my partner? And I basically told John, the last thing I want to be is part of that venture capital tribe, especially with the software industry, because nobody knows what they're doing. And he said, well, that's exactly why you should do this with me, because we would be the first, and we, you know, you have more experience than these venture capitalists, you know, in software. You've actually built a company and sold it. And I said no. So John stalked me for a year. I mean, literally stalked me. And John is 6'10". I'm 5'2". John went to Princeton undergrad, played for 6 years in the National NBA. He was first round draft pick out of Princeton.
Wow. Then
went back to Stanford and got his MBA, and then became a venture capitalist. So he'd been a venture capitalist for about 5 years. And during that period of time, I did all sorts of interesting things. Projects for bigger companies, really to sort of broaden my view of the software industry.
Sure.
But it was a tough time for starting companies, software companies, because the PC era had ended, and we weren't yet into the distributed computing era, let alone the internet. So that worked to John's advantage, saying, you know, you don't want to start a company yet. You know, any minute there'll be some breakthrough, and, you know, then we should be investing. So I finally agreed to co-found Hummer Winblad with John. We were equal partners, and we went out to raise the money. After 130 meetings where people said to us the following: having a fund that invests only in software is the stupidest thing we've heard.
Oh, wow.
We had 130 plus no's. We finally got a yes. We went back to Minnesota. We went to a Minnesota company, 3M, and they said, you know, we'll back our hometown girl.
Wow.
And software sounds good enough to us. And they said yes. They called IBM and said, you should invest in these two. IBM invested. IBM called someone else, and we were on our way with our fund. The first year of our fund, there was about 300 million globally invested in software. Last year, there was 60 billion. So we were right that software was going to be a big investing area.
Yeah.
And it was very advantageous for us to start early. So it wasn't an easy start for John to convince me. That took a year. It wasn't easy for us to raise the fund. That took another year. So we made our first investment in 1989 in a little company called Teamaker, run by my good friend Heidi Roizen.
What an amazing story.
Yeah,
It's really-
it seems so long ago. It's almost 30 years ago.
Yeah. So, software, there has been big growth and big change.
Yeah.
In fact, a little over 10 years ago, of the top 10 highest valued public companies, Microsoft was the only highest valued public tech company. The rest of the companies on the list were oil and gas and banking.
Mm-hmm.
Hummer Winblad, your focus has always been software, specifically the enterprise software industry.
Yes.
What have been some of your most successful exits?
We've had many. Our fund has performed extremely well. We always start at the A round, so we have a long relationship with these companies. In our first fund, two guys came in, Jim and Bob. Bob was a rocket scientist. He worked for NASA. Jim was a sales guy at a enterprise software company no one had ever heard of. But they said, look, business intelligence is going to be really big, and we're going to start this business intelligence segment. And they started a little company, which you will know as Hyperion. We gave them their A round. We convinced Sequoia to join us in that round. Doug Leone and I were the lead investors on that deal. They went public 5 years later, and then a few years after that were acquired by Oracle for $3.3 billion. So $1 billion exits did happen in that era. Also in that fund was a little company called PowerSoft, which was the first billion-dollar exit of any software company. They also went public. A guy named Mitchell Kurtzman, who's now a partner here and has been a partner here for over a decade at Winblad, founded that company. So we got off to a great start. They were acquired by Sybase, and Mitchell then became the CEO of Sybase. Mm-hmm. Recently, about 12 years ago, we got a call. I got a call from an enterprise analyst saying, "Hey, I cover Oracle, IBM, TIBCO, and this funny little company keeps showing up." I said, "What's the company's name?" And they said, MuleSource. And this is how deals work. And I said, "Well, where are they?" He said, "Well, the founder's in Malta." I have to admit, I did not even know where Malta was at that point in time. I knew it was somewhere near Italy. But I now know where it is. So I tracked down the founder, Ross Mason. Ross was in Malta, one guy was in Germany, 2 guys in Buenos Aires, and 1 guy here. And we funded them. 10 years later, they went public as MuleSoft, as an exceptional IPO in 2017. And last spring, they were acquired by Salesforce for $6.7 billion. So there is a good example of the differences also. For Hyperion, whose exit was $3.3 billion, it was, all in all, a 5-year journey to an IPO. For MuleSoft, whose exit ultimately was $6.7 billion, it was a 10-year exit to an IPO. So we have many of these companies now that are in year 1, year 2, and we're hopeful they'll have those billion-dollar exits as well. And there's many other billion-dollar exits we have.
Sure. So typically, how many investments do you make in a year, and what's the average size of the investment?
On a year where we're very active, we might make about 6 new investments. Mm-hmm. And those investments are all, again, the first institutional round in. Some of the companies might have angel money, mm-hmm. and they might, if it is a pre-A round, mm-hmm. it might be fairly small, a couple million. Yeah. If it is a true A round, the round itself is probably $4 to $5 million. And we will most likely, even with that $4 to $5 million round, invite another investor to join us on our term sheet, mm-hmm. because we like to have multiple people around the company. We think having just one venture capitalist is like having a boss. 2 is like having a board. But they're really, every company is judged separately. We look at their operating plan and how much money we think it will take them to get to the next risk reduction point where they'll be more valuable to the next round investor. So the numbers vary per company. It's not a cookie cutter approach to investing.
Sure, yeah. That was a little bit of a tricky question, actually, anyway, yeah. My next question to you is, how hands-on is Winblad with its investments?
Well, every investor is different in the role they play. I can speak how I work with companies, and it's probably very similar to how my other partners work, but I'm not at their board meetings. The most important thing that we can do as a venture capitalist for our companies is to make sure they have the right CEO. Mm-hmm. Many times, like Hyperion, Jim Dorian, the founding CEO, took that public. In the case of MuleSoft, we recruited Greg Schott a couple years in to be the CEO, and he was and is a fantastic CEO. Mm-hmm. So if you have the right CEO, you are then a very good resource to the board. You're not really hands-on. You are available. You share with the entrepreneurs in the early stage what you've learned. It's important as a venture capitalist that you don't tell but teach. If there's something that you've learned that you can share. You also share learnings amongst your portfolio companies, and we herd them together frequently so they can have more honesty with each other than they might have with us. But the truth is that we don't know everything that goes on in these companies day to day, nor should we. We have a fiduciary responsibility on the board to all shareholders, the common shareholders, the investors. But the best thing we can do is to be a trusted, respected resource to the leadership team. And that is the closest you should come to hands-on.
Sure. What do you believe makes for a successful entrepreneur?
You know, it's a really tough job building a company from scratch. I know that from my own experience. Once you've built it, you have this creation myth where you describe how you built the company and whatever, and you sort of skip the ugly parts because the ugly parts are not important to you. It's really the, I made it, I'm finally here. But it takes a lot of intellectual and physical stamina to really start and run a young company. So that intellectual stamina is really, really important. It takes someone who is willing to have a lot of intellectual honesty, where they can admit, hey, I might be down the wrong path. Yeah. You need to have the ability to take risks, but modulate risks. Now that sounds contrary, but it's really an important thing, is how you know how to push the envelope without driving over a cliff versus driving too slowly so you're always in the slow lane. So this kind of intellectual quality of stamina, honesty, and modulated risk, but a risk taker, is really, really key. Last but not least, and probably the most important, is the ability to attract excellence. And that means attract investors that are excellent, attract customers that are great, attract employees that are great, attract partners, and that all means that all of this brain power you have, that you're able to move your mouth and communicate well to all those stakeholders that build great companies, that you deserve to have all this excellence around you.
What have been some of your greatest career setbacks?
Well, I don't think I've had very many setbacks. There always are roadblocks.
Yeah.
And you can view roadblocks as setbacks, or you can view them as challenges. So I've always viewed obstacles as challenges, and frankly, I love challenges.
Yeah.
People frequently call me up and say, can you mentor me? And I go, no, I'm not a mentor, I'm a challenger. I'm not here to make you feel good. I'm here to set an obstacle in front of you and see how you do with it. Yeah. It was definitely an obstacle when we got 132 no's that it was a really dumb idea to start a venture capital firm focused on software. Yeah. But you would think that I would have turned to John Hummer after he spent a year stalking me saying, see, I told you so, nobody wants us to be venture capitalists. But instead, more than ever, I wanted to be a venture capitalist then.
Yeah.
It's like, just wait and see, I'll be a great venture capitalist. So those of you who said no, you watch me.
Yeah.
And that kind of thing I really like. It was a big challenge in the early days of open systems to find dollars to buy equipment. And the computers we needed were like, even though they're the early PCs, they had the early Intel 8080 chips in them, they cost $25,000 each. And I needed a couple of them for our programmers. I mean, I said, two of you can work in the day and two of you can work at night. Yeah. But there was no way to get $50,000. My family had never seen excess cash of $50,000. I still had student loans that I was paying off, even though I had made a great salary my 1 year. And I was actually 24 when I started the company.
Oh, wow.
So I made a list of all the banks in Minneapolis and St. Paul, and there were 10 of them. And I started with the smallest one, which was the one where I was paying off my student loans. I showed them all the loans I'd paid off, and I gave them a little presentation, and they bowed their head and said no. So by the time I got to bank 8, I realized I knew when they were going to say no. It was always a guy, and he would put his head down. He wouldn't look me in the eye, and I knew as soon as that head went down, that was a no, because nobody. If they're going to say yes, they say it proudly. No, they say it meekly. Yeah. And so I practiced at home crying in front of a mirror. So on bank number 9, because I had 2 left, bank number 9, which was the second largest bank in the Twin Cities at the time. As soon as I saw that head bow, I burst into tears. That bank gave me $50,000.
Wow.
Because they couldn't stand seeing a young woman cry.
That's so funny.
And so that was my challenge. How do I get that $50,000?
Yeah.
I had no collateral. I owned nothing. I rented an apartment. I had student loans. The three guys, that had helped start the company with me, they had nothing. They didn't have $50,000. So, we spent our meager savings flying around to things. So, it was a challenge.
What a great story.
So I don't view that I've had setbacks, but I've had challenges, which I love.
Sure. What is it that makes you the happiest about your job?
It is really magical when these companies have these great exits. Yeah. It's not the thing that makes me the happiest, but it's still magic.
Yeah.
It was it was March 17th on 2017 when MuleSoft went public. And, it's not like I've not been to public company starts, but every one of these is magical. You realize that there were 5 people in 4 countries and 0 revenue and a big idea and one visionary, Ross Mason, a great CEO. We had the luck to hire Greg Schott. And there were then 1,100 employees and a company growing really rapidly that had a super successful IPO. I'm also proud to say that hundreds of employees made $1 million or more that day, and probably more as the company grew in value. So it's the same feeling that I had when my company was acquired. It was bittersweet to be acquired, as you have all these employees and whatever, but it's just magical holding that check, is that what we're doing, which is really what I love, this whole software thing, it's still this invisible business where code turns into businesses. And that magic of taking that Fortran class in college is still there on those amazing moments where, hey, this company is worth today over $3 billion, and then another magic moment a year later over $6 billion. It is. I can still think back to, programming on a DEC, mini computer, typing up those cards, sticking them in, and making software. So being part of this industry is joyous to me and magical.
Yeah. What advice do you have for entrepreneurs in running successful software companies?
I wish there was a playbook for both the venture industry. If there was a playbook for venture capital, we'd be called capitalists. The venture would be gone. It's a high-risk business. And for entrepreneurs as well. The numbers are daunting. For every 1,000 companies that get a first round of capital, only 200 will make it to their Series C. And 90% of companies are not acquired until after that Series C. I think the main thing is, really, for entrepreneurs, really make sure you're ready for this, that, you are willing to take these risks, to, have the intellectual stamina, to always have a plan B, but most of all, to put down a set of assumptions, less than 10. I always cite, and I did not go to Harvard, I'm one of those non-pedigreed venture capitalists. I went to a school no one's heard of, but it's a great school. But Michael Porter has a great book called Competitive Advantage, and in it is a chapter called The Value Chain. And it articulates in very academic ways how to put down a set of assumptions, that what your pricing strategy is, who your competition is, and write them down. I did that early on. I wrote them down on a whiteboard, and in the early days, once a month, look up at them. If they're still true, keep going. If one of them is false, figure out what you're going to change. As time goes on, do it once a quarter. because you don't have any facts as an entrepreneur. You really don't. You know, we have a lot of facts about the industry, but we don't have facts about new businesses. So make sure that those assumptions are turning into fact cards over time. It's called having a strategy. Yeah. And you can simplify strategic planning very easily by just reading that chapter in Michael Porter's book. Yeah. And you don't have to go to Harvard to have read the book.
And thank you so much. It's been a pleasure having you on the show, and it's great to meet you, and I hope to see you again.
It's great to meet
later.
you as well. Thanks for doing the show. Absolutely. I hope you enjoy the show.
Absolutely. Folks, thanks for joining us. We will see you next time. Bye-bye.